Welcome, everybody. Welcome to The World We Want and the third session of the PMAC conference being beamed worldwide to you today. It's very exciting to be part of this conference, and we've got some fantastic speakers to discuss the subject of the next hour and a half, which is scaling up efforts to tackle the climate crisis and building forward greener. This conference is indeed entitled The World We Want, and it's focusing on some of the mega trends that are shaping the future of our planet and our people today. Health and climate, biodiversity, the environment, to which I would also add, of course, the importance of food systems, some of the commercial and economic determinants of our health and well-being, the continued rapid urbanization that we're seeing, shifts in population that threatens the financial and economic security that we've relied on for so long, the continuing legacy of and strain of colonization, a system of global governance that sadly still disenfranchises billions of people, and a geopolitics that seems today, incredibly, that is creating conditions for war, conflict, inequality, and continued social exclusion. So we have a lot of big questions that we've got to solve in the next 90 minutes. And we have the panel to do it for you. So this is the session. And if you're with us, then fantastic. You're going to have the ride of your lifetime. I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one as we go. You've seen them already in the animation. And we're going to start off with a very close colleague and friend of mine, Professor Andy Haynes, who's Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And let me just say to you all, each participant is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and I want you to start pumping your questions into the chat so that we can have a really vigorous and exciting discussion when you've heard from them all. So Andy, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. Let me just check you can hear me clearly. I assume you can. So what I would like to do is to share a few reflections of health in the aftermath of COP26, the climate change conference that occurred in Glasgow last year. I, together with many other health professionals, attended that conference, and I'd like to share a few reflections with you. So the Paris Climate Agreement aims to limit the average global temperature increase to 2 degrees, less than 2 degrees centigrade, to enhance resilience and adaptation to climate change, and to align the financial flows in the world with these objectives. And for the first time, really, health had a significant presence at the Conference of the Parties. There was a World Health Organization pavilion, which hosted around 60 events. There was a global conference on health and climate change, and there was a special report from WHO on the health argument for climate action. So Indeed, health was a much higher profile than previously. But at the same time, sadly, I think it was often health professionals talking to each other rather than health really penetrating centrally into the negotiations themselves. What are some of the headline messages that came out? Well, clearly now health is being impacted on by climate change. There's now no doubt about that at all. We're at about 1.2 degrees global average temperature increase compared with pre-industrial. And we can now say with confidence that many events, climate events that are taking place, would not have taken place without human-induced climate change. A recent estimate, for example, suggests that over 30% of heat-related deaths in recent decades can be attributed to climate change. In other words, they wouldn't have happened in the absence of human-induced climate change. And we don't have data in many of the key parts of the world, much of sub-Saharan Africa, much of South Asia, for example, to know what's really happening there. So climate change has a range of impacts on health, ranging from the very direct to, like heat, for example, effects of extreme events, floods, droughts, effects on food systems, of course, as Richard mentioned briefly, effects on infectious diseases, increasing poverty, migration, possibly conflict. And the effects are not just on physical health, but also mental health effects. And we're now becoming aware that there are pervasive mental health effects following, for example, floods, droughts, wildfires, and so on. So there's increasing evidence that health is being impacted on now, and this will only get worse depending on the action that we take over the next few years. So what are some of the things that happened at COP26 that can give us some degree of measured optimism against this overall pessimistic view? One was that 52 countries have now committed to building health systems which are able to withstand the impacts of climate change and which are low carbon and sustainable. And 14 countries set a deadline of 2050 or earlier by which their health system will reach net zero emissions. That's not just for the direct emissions, but also the indirect emissions in their supply chain. So that was an important step forward. Of course, it has to be implemented, but it's an important landmark. The second was that methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, for the first time was really tackled within the discussions. And the global methane pledge launched by the US, the EU, and a number of partners announced more than 100 signatories to the agreement covering half of global methane emissions. So that's good for the climate, could reduce the global heating by 0.2 degrees by 2050. And the Paris rulebook, which sounds very boring, but it's also very important, which really aims to set the rules for international carbon markets and how to report and review greenhouse gas emission reductions, that was finally agreed. But there were many, many disappointments. One was really quite scandalous. Parties were unable to meet the $100 billion goal for climate funding agreed in 2009. And that goal is not likely to be reached until 2022 or 2023. And some nations refuse to accept any liability or provide compensation for loss and damage from climate change. Although parties settled on a text calling for the phase down of coal, it was hoped that it would be phasing out coal. And so that was really a step back at the last minute. So after COP26, where are we? Well, we're headed to a world of probably 2.7 degrees, something like that, global average temperature increase by the latter half of the century. And that will be devastating for health. So we need to do everything we can to avoid that potentially disastrous outcome. If we're very optimistic, we can still keep below 2 degrees. So it's really important that the voice of health professionals is raised to accelerate the ambition for action. Unfortunately, we know that many of the post-COVID stimulus packages are doing more harm than good to the environment. We pumped $17 trillion collectively into the global economy, into national economies, but much of that is misdirected, unfortunately, and will not accelerate the transition to the net zero economy. So what do we need to do? Well, very, very briefly, we need to mitigate, we need to cut emissions. And in doing so, we can improve human health by reducing air pollution, by improving access to healthy, sustainable, low emission diets, by enhancing physical activity through more sustainable transport systems, public transport, walking and cycling. So cutting emissions quickly is really important. But we're already committed to a substantial amount of climate change. So we have to adapt as much as we can, and that includes health systems, in order to reduce the risks of climate change to human health, those risks that we can't prevent. Well, how well is health reflected? in the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. These are the commitments that countries make to adhere to the Paris Agreement objectives. Well, again, an analysis presented at COP26 by the Global Climate and Health Alliance showed us that many nations are not capitalizing on the potential health benefits from reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the high-income countries actually are particularly lacking here, that many of them do not foreground the health in their nationally determined contributions. So there's a great deal of work that needs to be done to raise the profile of health, both in terms of mitigation, cutting emissions, and the co-benefits of doing so, but also adaptation, adapting to the climate change we can't prevent. So in conclusion, there's a great deal that can be done. Health professionals need to step up to the plate, and indeed they have been doing so increasingly, need to emphasize the potential benefits, the win-wins, the near-term benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not just in preventing dangerous climate change, but also in producing near-term co-benefits through cleaner air, through more sustainable diets and increased physical activity, as I mentioned. There's a great deal we can do to ensure that climate finance is more focused on health, and perhaps some of that climate finance can also help to address the challenges of universal health coverage, which of course is still a really substantial challenge for many countries. Increasingly, the health argument will be used to inform litigation. And increasingly, our colleagues in the legal professions are mounting cases. I think there are something like 1,000 legal cases going on around the world against governments to try to force them to accelerate their ambition. And the health argument will be a very important foundation for those cases. And increasingly, of course, it's not just at the country level, it's also at the subnational level. So working with cities, coalitions of cities like C40, the Mayor's Covenant and so on, is also an important goal for the health professionals. We need to foster shared learning. We need to foster mutual collaboration around active solutions for climate change. We know that a lot can be done, and yet these solutions are not being implemented at the speed and scale that's really necessary. So let's join together in learning the lessons from implementing rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions through evidence-based actions that would aim to improve health and health equity, including assessment of trade-offs, because sometimes policies can go wrong. We need regular reporting on progress using robust methods. We need to support mutual learning. We all need to learn lessons from each other, and we need to work collaboratively towards a future, a net zero future over coming decades, which helps to sustain and support health in the face of the climate emergency. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Andy. Well done. That's brilliant. Got us off to a great start. I can already think of lots of questions to ask you, and I want to encourage the viewers. We've got 120 attendees I can see at the moment. I'd like to see you all pop in your questions that you would like to pose to Andy and our panel. Let's move straight away to Elizabeth Watuti, who is a climate activist. Welcome, Elizabeth. And you are indeed founder of the Green Generation Initiative in Kenya. Elizabeth, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And just to add that I'm Elizabeth Watuti, an environmentalist and a climate activist from Kenya. And in addition to being the founder of the Green Generation Initiative, I also head campaigns at the Wangari Maathai Foundation. 2 months ago, I traveled to Glasgow to address over 100 world leaders at the UN COP26 climate negotiations. I told them about the climate-related droughts we are facing in Kenya right now, and about the 2.1 million of my fellow Kenyans who are facing starvation. I asked them to open their hearts and to take immediate action. But what they came up with, the Glasgow package, still spells great danger for our continent. And even if all of the pledges made in Glasgow by governments are fulfilled, and that is a big if, the world will still be on track to experience warming well above 2 degrees. And Africa will warm at a faster rate than other continents. And what this means for communities like mine is more prolonged droughts, heat waves, floods, and an increase in climate-related disasters. The climate crisis is not just an environmental disaster. it poses a catastrophic risk to our health and our well-being. And in fact, it is the single biggest health threat facing humanity, according to the World Health Organization, with even more people projected to suffer from heat stress, exposure to disease, respiratory illness from breathing toxic air, and even anxiety. And these risks are not borne equally. Climate vulnerable communities like mine, women and children will be the most impacted. And globally, nearly half the world's children live in extremely high-risk countries, according to UNICEF. As a child, I got to love nature and to connect to nature at a young age. I was lucky to have grown up in the most forested region in Kenya, and I started planting trees at a tender age of 7. By planting trees, I was learning that I could grow things and give back to life. That love and feeling of being in relationship with the natural world has stayed with me. And every day through the Green Generation Initiative, I try to share it with the children. And these are children who understand in their hearts our reliance on nature, children who have the confidence to shape the environment around them. It is these children who will regenerate a world hit by climate change. But too often, we adults are undermining their efforts. Every day, they're breathing toxic air from cars that burn dirty fossil fuels. Air pollution is greatly impacting their health and costing lives. Every day, they are going to school hungry due to climate-forced drought and crop failure. Every day, they're also feeling anxiety about a future that looks bleak. But by planting a tree, the children are saying, I will not be a victim. And in their school compounds, they are planting trees, but on the other side of the school gates, they still see big corporations and governments cutting down forests. They see developers destroying ancient ecosystems to make more space for more dirty cars. So by doing this, we are undermining children's sense of agency. And by doing this, we are undermining children's sense of meaning. The big win in Glasgow was that leaders promised to come back again next year to revisit their level of ambition. But I believe that if anything is going to change, they will need to feel much, much greater pressure. And we, the young people, are doing what we can. 75% of us are afraid of the future. 45% of us are affected by climate anxiety every day. And 39% of us are even hesitant about having children of our own. But we are not sinking into despair. We have been mobilizing in great numbers since 2018. And there are now 16 million Fridays for Future school strikers across 217 countries calling on leaders to act. Every day, we are doing what we can to secure a livable environment for us and for the children to come. A future with some semblance of peace, security, good health, and well-being. But I fear that alone, the pressure we generate will not be enough. And my call today is for you to please join us. Join us in putting people and our planet above profits. The climate clock is ticking and time is running out. Addressing the climate crisis will take more than individual efforts. If governments, businesses, big corporations, and global leaders also join in and take ambitious, comprehensive, and urgent action now, we can definitely limit the impact of the climate crisis and ensure that we have a safe and healthy present and future for the world's children and also generations to come. And to change everything, we will definitely need everyone. So we have to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by the climate crisis to adapt and mitigate the impacts. And this means that developed countries have to deliver their promise to mobilize climate finance, including a new funding mechanism for loss and damage, and also to listen to voices of urgency in Africa. And this also means that in addition to stopping investments in fossil fuels, we also have to massively increase investments in nature regeneration and also make sure that we are keeping all our remaining natural ecosystems intact. We also need more climate activists and people power to stand up for climate justice, because it's through our pressure and collective action that we will make the real change happen. We can only rise to the challenges of the climate crisis by working together collectively, listening to the voices of young people who are calling for urgency in tackling the climate crisis, and then acknowledging that while we may all be in the same storm, we are definitely not in the same boat. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much indeed. And we've already started getting some questions coming through that I will pose immediately afterwards. And I'd love to come back to some of the issues that Andy and Elizabeth have already raised. Let's move on. It's a great pleasure indeed to introduce you to Gillian Caldwell, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID. Gillian, you're very welcome. You are the Climate Change Coordinator for USAID, so it's great to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Richard, for the introduction, and Elizabeth and Andy for your words, and of course to the organizers. Elizabeth, I just want to acknowledge the power of your words at COP, which were critically necessary, I think, in the context of a space where it's all too easy to get lost in the statistics and the fanfare. So thank you for that. So this whole conference is about scaling efforts to address climate change and building forward greener. And it's also about the connection between the climate crisis and the health crises that are emerging. And, you know, the US government is, I think, as was demonstrated at COP, really back in action on climate change after a very regrettable absence. At COP, USAID released a very bold strategy articulating our efforts to tackle the climate crisis. By 2030, we are aiming to do work that helps reduce or sequester 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. So that's equivalent to all US carbon emissions in a year. A critical part of that will be renewable energy, but of course, investing in nature and the restorative capacity of nature is critical. So we want to protect or restore 100 million hectares. That's a landmass more than twice the size of the US state of California. Very importantly, given the massive deficit in funding available for developing economies to both adapt and mitigate, we have a goal to mobilize $150 billion in public and private finance by 2030. This would, of course, complement the global community's commitment, which has yet to be met, to provide 100 billion per year, a minimum of 100 billion per year as agreed in Paris. We're also aiming through those actions and through the money that we catalyzed to improve the resilience of over 500 million people. This would be through early warning systems, through the investment in nature that helps protect and preserve the livelihoods of communities and their abilities to withstand severe weather shocks, such as the kinds we're seeing all around the world right now. I think most importantly, we want to move from talk to action. And if we don't start doing that, we are quite literally dead in the water here. So we have a presence in 100 countries with missions in 80 countries. And in all 80 countries where we have missions, we want to work alongside our country partners to support them in delivering on their nationally determined contributions and their national action plans. That will be through some combination of technical and financial assistance, and we're convening in late March with our allies amongst all the Nordic donors, for example, to talk about how we can ensure that every country is covered to the greatest extent possible with support. Finally, we really want to pursue all of the work we're doing with the climate crisis with equity squarely and centrally in mind. Indigenous peoples are critical to stewarding the ecosystems of the earth, and yet they have been foisted and dragged off their land for millennia. Additionally, women and youth like Elizabeth that play such a critical role need to be empowered and enabled to lead. So we are looking in 40 of the countries where we're active to intervene to support policy changing interventions to enable the engagement of Indigenous people, women, and youth and other marginalized communities to participate and lead when it comes to climate action. I just want to speak briefly to health, because of course, climate change and health is a central focus of this conference. And here, as Elizabeth said, we are in the same storm, but we are definitely not in the same boat. So when it comes to the consequences of climate change, the poorest and most marginalized people who have the least responsibility for creating these problems are the ones that are hit first and worst. We have several important related programs on the health front. One is a program we're just launching called Clean Air Catalyst, which is focused on combating the air pollution that Elizabeth referred to. The World Resources Institute and Environmental Defense Fund are two of our allies in that front. And we're focused there on cities, which of course are on the front lines of a growing health and climate crisis. More than 6 million people die each year from causes related to air pollution. And nearly 80% of air pollution related deaths are occurring in low and middle income countries. So through the Clean Air Catalyst program, we'll work with local communities starting in 3 cities, Indore in Indonesia, it'll be Indore in India, Jakarta in Indonesia. We were planning on moving into Ethiopia, but current conditions in Ethiopia have precluded that. So we're looking for our 3rd city. And the focus there is really to identify and test the places where the deepest sources of air pollution are emerging and to address those problems at the source. We also have our HEARTH program, which is Health, Ecosystems, and Agriculture for Resilient, Thriving Societies. And there we're focused on really creating sustainable opportunities that put less pressure on wildlife and their habitats by increasing community resilience and economic opportunity. We are going to see more and more pandemics if we do not address climate change, because zoonotic transfer of disease is going to increase. We also have our Power Africa initiative to tackle energy poverty in Africa. And in that context, we are collaborating with our Global Health Bureau and the President's Malarial Initiative to focus on electrifying health clinics across Africa with renewable energy, which will not only decarbonize, but also improve health outcomes. Finally, we have an important initiative harkening back to Ethiopia regarding malaria. A lot of our work relates to early warning systems. We have collaborations with NASA and others that enable us to predict forthcoming weather threats, as well as pandemic risks and malarial risks. So we're working to integrate the technology to provide the insight to community systems on the ground to try to tackle outbreaks before they proliferate. So let me stop there, with the final word that we can talk as long as we wish, and we have been talking for 26 COPs, but I really hope by the 27th, which will be this November in Egypt, we'll be able to come to the table with some concrete results under our belt. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gillian. And let me just second the fact that it's great to see the United States back in action. Back at the table. We need you. It's only when you're not there that we realize how much we need you. So thank you very much for all the work that you and your colleagues do. Let me turn now to Iferemi Wakenabesi, who is Minister for Health and Medical Services in Fiji. Iferemi, it's wonderful to have you with us. You are indeed speaking from Fiji, and it's very early in the morning for you. And I just want to, on behalf of PMAC, thank you for your willingness to commit to this session. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Richard. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also my colleagues that are speaking today. The climate crisis and the associated environmental degradation underscores what is the greatest global health challenge facing the 21st century. It dictates that we have a One Health approach that addresses all the global challenges, the nexus between human, animal, and environmental health. And the crisis plainly hinders our progress to the world we want and the world we hope. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, report on global warming states that it's necessary to maintain the global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. As we put it, ease our adaptation efforts, and the world will suffer fewer negative impacts on intensity and frequency of extreme events, on resources, ecosystems, biodiversity, food security, the cities, the tourism, and carbon removal. Therefore, building forward greener is no longer an option, but a necessity that supports below 1.5 degrees target. Richard, the last 8 days I've spent in a group of islands in Fiji near Tonga. We had gone to see and make assessments after the volcano in Tonga. And we can actually see that already the islands have been challenged with rising sea levels. And the tsunami actually again perpetuates the problem that already exists. Climate change poses a direct and severe threat to our human health, particularly in the small island states, where our healthcare facilities are prone to damages by natural disasters. And in addition, we have climate-sensitive diseases that threaten to increase with climate change. And I keep on making this statement: we cannot change our coordinates. We are locked in the Pacific. And for Fiji, we are locked in at the 180-degree meridian. WHO in 2014 estimated by between 2030 and 2050, climate change can cause close to 250,000 additional deaths due to malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, and heat stress. And what we're beginning to see in the Pacific is that because of rising sea levels and increased population, there's not even spaces in some islands to be able to have parks for people to be able to walk and certainly prevent NCD. So it's having an indirect effect on non-communicable diseases. And the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the close relationship that we as people have and the health of us as people and the health of the planet. And it's further exacerbated existing social injustices and vulnerabilities in communities and our health systems. As outlined in the WHO Special Report on COP26, the pandemic has also provided an opportunity for building forward better, greener, and more equitably. Building forward greener is a global drive that encompasses country-specific actions projected from all communities and industries, perhaps with a more attention to the transport, construction, and energy sectors, to name a few. In the health sector, Building Forward Greener is aligning climate and health goals with COVID-19 recovery efforts, supporting a fossil fuel-free recovery, enhancing capacity for pandemic preparedness, and strengthening the implementation of health in all policies approach, and committing to vaccine equity, among others. At COP26, leaders were urged in Glasgow to urgently and significantly scale up their adaptation finance and at the same time submit a 5-year nationally determined contribution pledges. These pledges directly support the 1.5 degree target. And at the COP26 Health Program Initiative, the Governor of Fiji, through our ministry, has committed to our citizens 3 major steps. Firstly, is a commitment to climate resilient health system. We will continue to develop our health system to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. This includes our commitments to conducting climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessment that informs health policies and programs, and update the health component of the National Adaptation Plan based on new evidence arising from climate change and health vulnerability assessment. 2, we've committed to a sustainable low-carbon health system. We will develop our health system to be sustainable and low-carbon, ensuring it contributes to meeting the emission targets of the Paris Agreement. This includes our commitment to publish an action plan for developing a sustainable low-carbon health system by June 2024 and reach net zero health sector emissions by 2050 through eradicating emissions under the direct control of health service delivery and associated supply chain. And I just want to stop there by saying that always there's an argument that countries in small island development states such as Fiji has a very low carbon footprint. And why do we need to make that commitment? We need to make that commitment, even though we have a very small carbon footprint, because we need to show the world that we are leading in our wanting to protect our island states. And thirdly, funding for health and climate change. We will seek to use the Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment, Health National Adaptation Plan, and our Action Plan for Sustainable Low Carbon Health System to facilitate access to climate change funding for health. As we meet today, Fiji is still recovering from the devastation of COVID-19 pandemic, experiencing the Omicron wave, as many other countries are. And the pandemic has shown us that the health systems and facilities are the main line of defense in protecting populations and emerging threats. Further, the pandemic reminds us to increase our commitment to a safer and more sustainable environment for all of us. For Fiji and the Pacific, adverse climate events means outbreaks of deadly climate-sensitive diseases, threaten food security, livelihood, and debilitating economic loss. When we scale up efforts to tackle the climate crisis, we're simultaneously building forward greener, acknowledging that climate change is a global health challenge and also a great opportunity to create the world we want. Ladies and gentlemen, we know what our targets are, and we know how to get there. And we acknowledge the threats that can come our way, such as disease outbreaks and adverse climate events and the consequences of falling short. We must make our aspirations clear, and the actions must be targeted and deliberate. And now, in my small country, Fiji is living in the climate change crisis, and we are doing something about it. The time for meaningful and long-lasting global actions to build for greener towards the world we want is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ephraimi. That's wonderful words from you. And of course, we do recognize the challenge that you and your colleagues have had in those islands near Tonga after the volcano. So thank you for your work. Let me turn to our final speaker. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Yun Ma, who is the director at the Institute of Public Environmental Affairs in China. And you are speaking from Beijing. And again, thank you for joining us. Let me hand over to you immediately. We're keen to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for having me. As all the guest speakers have pointed out, we're facing a pressing climate crisis, climate challenge in the world, and that's why the whole world came together, to sign a Paris Agreement and then gathered in Glasgow for another major COP. And China, during the process, have joined the efforts in 2000. In the year 2000, Chinese President Xi made the China's carbon peak and neutrality pledge commitment. So before 2030, China is going to peak its carbon emission, and before 2060, China will come to carbon neutrality. That was not an easy target. Minister Joaquin Napit mentioned about the small. A rather very small carbon footprint, but our footprint is much larger. It's with carbon dioxide, it's more than 10 billion metric tons. So to first try to pick that and then completely neutralize, it's a big task for us. And we're facing headwind. I have to acknowledge. Last year, the global energy crisis, in China, there's a power shortage, and not just China, but other major economies in the world all release some sort of fossil fuel capacity, and we're going to see a rebound of carbon emission globally. That is very, very unfortunate. And Professor Haynes mentioned about the term phasing out of coal having changed to phasing down. It's because of the recognition that in India, also in China and in some other countries, there's no other energy sources so far that can provide the base load. So it's very challenging. So at this in this situation, we have to turn to something more innovative solutions. when we look into our experience in dealing with local pollution, especially on the air pollution side, China used to suffer from very severe air pollution, and the city of Beijing, used to be, very regularly hit by the smog. As Elizabeth and Gillian both mentioned that this could have a very big health impact. But through all the efforts to monitor and disclose PM 2.5, and then build public awareness and strengthen government enforcement, empower public supervision, and also to use the market-based solutions, we managed to cut our air pollution level in general by more than half in just 8 years of time in China. The PM 2.5, or the fine particles concentration in Beijing, have dropped from nearly 90 micrograms in 2013 down to 34 last year. So that's quite a drop. And of course, this is we trust that that we need to, in our carbon neutrality endeavor, we also need to learn from that. So based on that, we as an organization have built a blue map for zero carbon. Over the past 16 years, we continue to work on transparency and build the first public interest database for all the air, water, soil, coastal sea, and emission data. But now we started to integrate all this carbon data into that. Not just only enough on the national level, but drill down to the cities and to the provincial emission and the city level emission. And based on that, we develop index to assess the performance of all major provinces and 110 cities, score them and rank them, and try to promote their environmental, their climate ambition, and also try to promote them to bend the curve, to peak, hasten the process, to peak and to bend the curve faster. And of course, we need to further drill this down to the industries and to the major enterprises. China is the factory of the world. We're not manufacturing for our own, but also to provide supply to many other parts of the world. So with that, a lot of carbon emission got embedded. So how to tackle that? We developed our infrastructure to try to help all these major companies to do digital accounting of their carbon footprint. It's a digital platform, and it's much more cost effective, and help them to set their target based on science-based target way. And through this, we managed to also provide a dynamic their dynamic environment and climate credit system for the brands and for the banks. During the pandemic, today we're talking about Build Back Better, and we're talking about the backdrop of the pandemic. Right? I still remember 3 months after the outbreak of the pandemic, we had one of the largest state-owned banks approach us. They want to give loans to small enterprises, but they cannot send their people on the ground to check their environmental impact, their environmental performance. So they turn to our big data. We're following millions of companies' performance in China and put 7 million of them on the digital map, all color-coded based on their environmental performance. So we help them run through first 80,000 companies who want to borrow money from them. And so far, during the past couple of years, help other banks altogether to run through 200,000 companies who want to borrow money in a digital way. And some of the largest brands globally and locally also started turning into this system. So far, they have motivated more than 16,000 suppliers to openly address their violations and started doing measuring and disclosure. So I want to close my talk by saying that, now China is by far the largest current greenhouse gas emitter, and we know it's our responsibility to really, really cut it down and bend the curve. But in the meantime, please don't think that you cannot do much because, China is having so much business relationship, together, through all this data, we can connect all these missing dots and help to green the whole global production, sourcing, investment, and eventually consumption. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a very refreshingly honest and direct set of comments. Jun, thank you. It is a question of every country recognizing that it's their responsibility to take action, and I think our speakers have demonstrated that today. Now, we've got questions coming through, which is great. So let's dive into some discussion. I'm going to come first of all to Andy, if I may. So Andy, you, at the beginning of your words, you did talk about some of the progress that was made at COP26 and some of the commitments that were made by these 50-odd countries on health systems strengthening and on getting to net zero by 2050 for 14 of them for their health systems. But my question to you is, who's going to hold these countries accountable for these promises? I mean, it's very easy to make promises and commitments at these big jamboree political events, but who's going to remember and who's going to make sure that there's delivery? Was that discussed?
Well, this is a big issue, Richard, not just for health systems, but of course for the whole climate change mitigation agenda. And that's why I think what Jun Ma was saying was so important, because there is actually getting a handle on the data and actually looking at the emissions and holding companies to account. And that's absolutely vital. Now, in terms of healthcare systems, of course, WHO has an important role there. These commitments were made in response to a WHO call, and WHO will be monitoring the implementation of those commitments over time. But I think it behoves all of us really to actually emphasize the need for accountability. It can't just be left to an international agency like WHO. It also has to be very much at the forefront of the health community as a whole. And we did see in the run-up to COP26, leaders of the health professionals, over 40 million health professionals, wrote to the heads of the G20 asking for much greater ambition around climate action. So we are beginning to see not just these official agencies, but also healthcare professionals, their representatives, their organizations, also stepping up to the mark. And I think it's going to be a very important task for the healthcare professions and for researchers like ourselves to actually put at the forefront the measurement, the accountability, because as you say, greenwash is so easy. There's so many people, there's so many aspirations at the moment of people wanting to cut emissions. And the work we've been doing with the Lancet Pathfinder Commission, which you're aware of, has also shown us that there's a big gap between the aspirations and what's actually happening on the ground. So when you ask for case studies of what's really happening, you don't find that many. And many of those case studies are not as rigorous as we would like to see. So one of the things we want to do is to establish guidelines for monitoring of the emissions, as Jun Ma has explained, but also of the health benefits, either exposures like air pollution or health outcomes. And that's going to be a real priority in the coming years. It's all about monitoring, accountability, honesty, transparency, and really ensuring that people don't get away with just aspirational greenwash kind of talk.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, Gillian, can I come to you on this? Because you rightly said, and it was great to hear you say this, we need to move, and the US wants to move from talk to action. How do we make sure that these actions are actually delivered? What's the view of the US government on this?
Well, there's no mechanism for international enforcement on these actions, as you've implied. Of course, under Article 6, those extensive and highly technical negotiations, we have come to some agreements regarding what counts and what doesn't. And I think that's incredibly important when you look at things like the very impressive Net Zero Banking Alliance with trillions of dollars under management committing to net zero. The question is, how do you get there? Same with the government commitments. And my worry is that, the first port of call has to be emissions reductions, carbon emissions reductions. Offsets cannot be, the primary solution here. I don't think we have enough verifiable, credible offsets available to us globally at this stage. So, I'm just worried that we need to really focus our energy on ensuring the viability of offsets, on ensuring the diplomatic relationships that will help pressure and support governments to step up to the plate to meet their commitments. I don't know what we can do short of that. I mean, there are, of course, opportunities to explore trade regimes. There are discussions along those lines to, there need to be incentives. There's no price on carbon in most contexts around the world. There's no agreed price on carbon. We helped set up the carbon market in Colombia, a voluntary carbon market. But carbon is moving for $5 to $10 per ton as compared to the 40 or 50 that you're paying in Europe. So there's so many inequities built into the system. It's sort of the Wild West when it comes to the carbon markets and offsets. And I think we really have to double down and think very carefully about how we're going to get where we need to go, because the commitments are one thing, but the roadmaps and the viability of delivery on those actions is another.
Thanks, Gillian. I mean, let me turn to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you rightly said in your words that we need to exert greater pressure as a health sector. And Gillian's talking about a stronger diplomatic initiative. How can we? I mean, you are a climate activist. This is your bread and butter every day. What can we do to be more effective communicators, to get our messages across from your experience about what has worked and what hasn't worked? Elizabeth.
I would say there are so many ways in which we can be able to get our messages across. But one of the key things that we really need to work on is to make sure that we are dealing with the crisis of listening and feeling, because I believe that that's the biggest challenge that we are currently facing when it comes to tackling the climate and the ecological crisis, because we are not listening to one another and we do not have the people who are on the front line of this crisis in our hearts, and we really do not understand the scale at which the impacts have continued to hit hard on the people who have least contributed. And still, even when it comes to these negotiations, the people who are the most impacted by the crisis are still watching from the sidelines. They are not in the rooms where the decisions are being made. And this exactly is the huge problem. So if we find ways of which we can make sure that people are listening, because the climate movement has existed for so many years, and even the youth climate movement that has continued to put pressure on leaders are still continue to exist for many years. And yet still we don't see the decisions that we are saying we need to see being made right now, because there's still a lot when it comes to people coming to the climate negotiations to only be able to deal with their own personal benefits in their countries. We do not come into these negotiations for collective action. We come to make sure that we are pushing agendas for individual countries, which should not be happening. And so I have strongly for a long time believed in the power of speaking on the angle of love and compassion, and making sure that we continue to speak deeply to our deep sense of humanity, because that is lacking. Because if we really have the people who are being impacted by the crisis right now at heart, and we have them as a priority, then we will be able to give outcomes and packages that are really going to benefit them. Because right now it's more of pledges and commitments, but those are not going to help people whose lives and livelihoods are in balance right now, they need us to understand that people are going through the worst impacts of the crisis. And so being able to communicate what is happening on the ground is one of the things that can really work to make sure that we are changing the way in which people need to view the crisis. We need to humanize the climate crisis because people are really suffering from the crisis, but unless we listen to the stories of communities in the front lines, we will not understand the depth. And then we need to communicate this, and with the people who will understand strongly and feel the heartbreaks and the injustice that have gone into this crisis, we are the ones who will make everyone else change, and then collectively we will make a difference. But unless we have everybody else involved, it's going to be difficult for us to change everything. We need everyone involved, and this involves making sure that we are championing for both system change and individual responsibility, because we cannot separate the two of them.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you. I really do. It does resonate when you say that there's a crisis of listening and feeling, and your message that we need to humanize that crisis. That's a real message, I think, to those of us from the scientific and medical communities, and we're not very good at humanizing that crisis. We tend to talk in terms of numbers and figures and tables and graphs and spreadsheets, but we don't often humanize. Let me turn to Ephraimi here. Now, Ephraimi, you're sitting there as Minister for Health and Medical Services. You understand the mechanics of government, the politics of the possible. Tell us a little bit about how we can make more effective arguments to ministers, to governments, so that we can accelerate the change that we're talking about. How does government work, Ephraimi?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's very important to have the political ambition. That is so important, so vital. We are blessed in Fiji that our Prime Minister is a champion for climate change. So, every ministry, every agency takes its cue from that leadership. And, so that's important. Obviously, the manifesto of the party is predetermined in what we want to do around climate change. And so political ambition is so important. I say that, Richard, because in my former life, I was a surgeon in theatre, and we often talked about how we're going to make health better and how can we get more equipment. And finally, after stepping in and becoming a politician, becoming a minister, then I realized that you can really drive policy from that stage. So I think that's the first and foremost thing, is to actually develop the political ambition. It will mean having the right people that actually want to see this come to the fore and happen, and at the right places to be able to develop it. It also means that the other part to it is actually driving it throughout the whole government bureaucracy. So the adaptation plan is not only limited to central ministries, but are shared out to every other peripheral ministry. And so they all understand that they all play a participatory role in driving the ambition of climate change. Because sometimes you develop a policy and it looks nice, and you do it because it is thematic, and you do it because the elections are near. And then when that does finish, and then it stays with central ministries. But it is important to be able to develop it and then take it out to the peripheral ministries, because at the end of the day, the central ministries are play an important role in terms of planning, in terms of driving resources, but making the operational part of it is the peripheral ministries. So the Minister of Health, Minister of Infrastructure, these are the ministries that actually drive it at the peripheral point of view. And thirdly, is that once you develop that, once you've got the leadership that believes in climate change, you've got the policies that are driven at the central ministry level and down into the peripheral levels, then you develop a whole of nation approach to climate change. So it's the other agencies, the CSOs, the corporate social, the the NGOs in Fiji, the community systems, the villages, that needs to be driven. But again, it begins with government. Government has to take the leading step. That's it.
Thank you very much. I really like your emphasis on the need for political ambition. In the previous panel, earlier that was chaired by Fran Baum, we discussed the fact that so often politicians don't have that vision, that ambition, and the management of the day-to-day problems of politics can somehow constrict the ambition, reduce the ambition. So maybe that's one of our roles, to encourage our politicians to really be ambitious in what their vision is, and then to support them in that way. I want to come to a couple of questions that have come through on the chat now, if I may. Now we've had a question from Samuel Cherubin, and I want to address this to Jun Ma, please, because Jun, you talked about the importance of digital technology, and the question from Samuel is about the role of digital health. So the question is, what is the role of digital health, digital technology? What is the role of the private sector in that digital space? And what is the role of climate startup, the climate startup community? So maybe you could talk a little bit about digital technology, the digital industry, and develop the point that you began to make in your remarks. Jun.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think digital technology can be so vitally important. When we started 16 years ago to try to deal with massive air, water, and soil pollution and coastal seas, and we started with 3 full-time plus half a dozen volunteers. You can imagine this is the size of China, 1.4 billion people, and so without the technology, at that time we're so privileged to have the technology of internet, and then website, and then database technology, and gradually, our data volume is getting increasingly increased, and government also started using a lot of online monitoring and censoring technologies. So at the beginning, our data is very limited. We can manually process that, but gradually we cannot. From 2014, China became the world's first country to require major companies to install online monitoring devices and report every hour or every 2 hours of their emission data. So far, now every day we got more than 3 million emission data into our database, and 1 million monitoring data on the air quality and water quality combined. So, and all this came from 5,000 sources, because we're trying to track the performance of 10 million corporations in China, and with at least half a million of them got quite significant carbon footprint. So with that, all this coming from different sources, we need AI technology to try to process all this PDF and sometimes graphic, and pull out all this content so that we can, structure the data and then use that to develop the digital, dynamic corporate credit credit, so that they can be we can use that. So all these are important. And now cloud computing, now AI, 5G, and Internet of Things, thinking about the digital accounting platform, when that is incorporated with all this Internet of Things monitoring, then it can be basically constantly, we can measure and report the carbon footprint. Madam Catwell and Professor Haynes all mentioned about the importance of MRV, the measure, reporting, and verification system. We need global system. Eventually, we can trust that. And now I think in Glasgow, we reached the agreement by the year 2000, the end of 2024, the world will came towards same standard on that, and China's preparing for that. And we, as an NGO, would be very happy to help with that. So we're preparing a database called the Brands MRV, and basically whoever made their commitment globally, we're gonna put them on that, their commitment, their target, zero carbon for scope 1, 2, but also scope 3, and how much they provide a progress bar to see how much they achieve that, especially in the factory of the world in China. So I hope that we can come together to build that together so that we can all trust and eventually, to prevent this to become only blah, blah, blah.
That's right, absolutely. Thanks, Jun. Any other comments on digital health and digital technologies and the contribution they may make? Jun's got a very optimistic view there, and
I mean, we invest, heavily in those technologies. I'm about to give you a but. Another example is the Forest Data Partnership we launched at COP with Unilever, one of the more progressive companies on economic and social governance. That's collaboration with Google that helps us identify deforestation and supply chains, because of course, agriculture is a primary driver of deforestation, and a lot of companies, throw their hands in the air, say these supply chains are complicated. I can't track, what's happening in all my supply chains. Well, this will end that argument. We hope. So that's really important. I do want to raise a flag, however, about artificial intelligence. Of course, those algorithms can be incredibly useful and, work at a trillion times of the human mind. But, there's a real concern that artificial intelligence is racist. Amongst other things. So if you look at how these algorithms are deployed in the United States, for example, with an important law that was passed regarding nonviolent offenders and trying to reduce the prison population, because we house more people in prisons per capita than anyone else in the world. It's clear that your eligibility for release under the First Step Act is greatly impacted by your race. And the analysis that algorithm is doing is regarding your likelihood to reoffend. Where cars are concerned, self-driving vehicles, it's been proven that algorithms make choices regarding who to hit effectively. And who gets hit and when algorithms are making those decisions. So I just think we need to pay careful attention to artificial intelligence and make sure we address the inequities that are embedded in many of those algorithms.
No, thank you for that caution. That's really important. Anybody else on the panel want to comment on digital? Oh yeah, Andy, do you want to say something? Go on.
Well, no, I do agree with. We do use AI ourselves in collaboration with others in sifting through the vast amounts of climate and health literature, which is, although it started from a low base, is expanding very quickly and is becoming increasingly difficult to kind of systematically review just using the old manual methods. So there are undoubted benefits, but I do agree with Gillian that this needs very close surveillance and understanding of what the implications of scaling up AI are. But I wanted to make a slightly different point, and that was about the importance potentially of citizen science. Because as we now have monitors, affordable monitors, in fact, I've got one just in front of me, an air pollution monitor, which is rather alarmingly said the PM10 level's gone up to 72, so I must be burning something nearby. But it's just an example of the way in which technology is making it possible to empower citizens to monitor their local environment and to make useful contributions to the collective endeavor of science and to understand, perhaps even to combat misinformation which has been such a problem, not just in COVID, but also climate. So engaging the public, the population, the wider population, ensuring that they are at least understanding the sort of basic methods of science, but also enabling them to collect reproducible data could be a very useful approach for the future in kind of scaling up some of the action at the community level. So this can be done at the micro level, but it can also be assembled at a much larger level to make sense of a bigger picture. So I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of, the importance of citizen science and also feeding some of that data to local decision makers so that they can act on the best available evidence. And that's particularly true at the local and the city level, where I think actions can take place to address some of the determinants of climate change and the health impacts of climate change.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andy. And I mean, in terms of citizen science, that's also important for accountability. Because it's citizens actually holding governments accountable that can really be an important and powerful force. And we haven't talked about civil society very much and community organizations and the role they have to play, but it's certainly been important in other parts of global health, and it's important here too. I want to turn to a question that's been posed by Alicia Draper, and thank you, Alicia, for your question. And she's getting to an issue which I think we've all struggled with, and that is we're very good in the health community about talking to ourselves. We're not so good about integrating ourselves into the broader climate change community. Andy did point that we made a little bit of progress in Glasgow, but still we're not that good at it. So her direct question to you all is, how can the health community better integrate into the climate change community and that thereby drive action? Who would like to take that one on first? Maybe I'll ask Ifiremi that question first. Can I come to you, because you're a minister for health? How do we make sure that, I mean, you talked about getting these issues through the bureaucracy of government. How do we integrate health across government, across other sectors?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. If we drive just a health agenda, it won't work. We need to make sure that the health agenda is part of the other priorities that are, that are thematic at that moment. So, the economy at the moment, a lot of countries are facing the economic brunt of the pandemic, and it's important to be able to sell the health agenda as an important component of the health economic recovery. The geographical inundations that happen with climate change, it's important to actually state in a way that the rising sea levels has an effect, on the health of the nation and the health of the people of the nation. So I think what I believe is important is actually not selling it as a standalone item, but incorporating it into the other important themes or priorities that are within the nation. And every nation is sovereign, and they have their own, even though you may have a nation close to one another, every nation has its own, priority, irrespective of whatever political party comes in. So it's important to actually drive the health agenda as part of the overall agendas that are in play, and rather than a standalone item.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Other comments on this, answering this question about integrating health into the broader climate movement? Gillian.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think this relates to a really central challenge and opportunity we face at USAID, which is how to fulfill our potential, as our administrator, Samantha Power, has said, to be a climate agency. We're a development agency, and she's repeatedly referring to us of late as a climate agency. And that's because climate can help or hinder, or actions or inaction on climate can help or hinder every development objective that we hold dear. So the question becomes, how do we get a whole of agency response on climate change? How does the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs step up their engagement to ensure preparedness to reduce the costs of responding to extreme weather events? How does the health team join forces with us to electrify clinics with renewable energy to improve health outcomes? How do they join with us when it comes to pollutants and air quality? So in every case, for every program, while we're heavily earmarked, we have restrictions on our funding, there are creative ways to advance the objectives that we're mandated to while integrating climate change. Education, for example, they have strict targets on numeracy and literacy, but that team is thinking about how to integrate climate relevant curricula into the numeracy and literacy work that they're doing. So I think this calls for a cross-sectoral response at every level. And there's no corner of the earth or our experience that is untouched by the changes that are forthcoming and that are already here to stay.
Thanks, Gillian. Elizabeth, can I ask you about this? Because in many ways, in terms of your activism, you are working across sectors all the time. You opened your talk by talking about those Kenyans facing starvation, the threats to children, in addition to the broader dimension of climate change. So how do we get that crosstalk across sectors? Your experience?
I would say it's important to note that every sector contributes to the climate crisis in different ways. And in that, it means that every sector also has to contribute and to be a part of the solution. And it's in the same way that we cannot leave activism and climate-related work to only a specific group of environmental activists or enthusiasts. It has to be everyone's responsibility. And so every sector has got to make sure that whatever actions are happening right now are at par with making sure that we are being a part of the solution and not a part of the pollution and the problem. And so it goes hand in hand in, apart from making sure that we are just, we are integrating and really being part of the conversations, that we are also being a part of the solution. And one of the key things that many people still have not integrated is the aspect of education and capacity building. And most of the people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis are still the same group of people that have been left on the sidelines, even when it comes to accessing all the information that they need to even deal with climate-related disasters. And so every sector has got a key role when it comes to making sure that these people have got the required information, they have got the required amount of resources to deal with the crisis as well, because it is not possible for people on the front lines of the crisis to deal with the crisis that they have not created on their own. So we have to make sure that every sector equally contributes to being part of the solution. And it's only that there are sectors that have to do much more than others, because again, we have to look also at the aspect of historical emissions. The more emissions and the more challenge that you have contributed, the more work that you have to do compared to those people that have least contributed. And one of the things that I have been focusing on a lot, and I've seen a lot of sectors really working on this, is through the education sector, making sure that everyone is being a part of the solution. Because when you educate the children and the young people in the schools and make sure that the kind of projects that are being brought into the schools also benefit them and help them deal with the crisis at the moment, crises like the issue of food insecurity. And a practical example is the fact that through the Green Generation Initiative, we realized that most of the children that we were reaching out to in terms of making them understand about the climate crisis are the same children that would spend a whole day in school without a meal. And so we realized that this cannot just be about planting trees. It has to be about making sure that we are growing trees that benefit them as well. So we started to establish food forests in their school compound where we plant mixed species of fruit trees. And this means that it provides something nutritious for the children every day, because when they are mixed species, it means that in and out of seasons, they have a fruit to eat at the end of the day. And that means tackling challenges and finding solutions to challenges at that time, and not really every time making commitments and pledges, but realizing that there's something that can be done right now and can be able to benefit a bigger population of people. And so taking issues from the aspect of dealing with the challenges at the moment and also dealing with the root causes of the problem, it was very easy for every sector right now to integrate climate-related solutions into what is happening. But we have to realize that the challenges right now are only going to be solved by ourselves, and we cannot sit back and wait for other sectors or wait for environmental organizations or sectors that deal with climate to do it. It has to be collective action. And when I mean that to change everything, we need everyone, it also includes individuals and each and every sector. And if we work together, I do believe that we will have halfway solved this crisis, but every sector has got something that they can contribute. And it's also about collaborative efforts at the same time, because there is one way in another that every sector can complement another sector. And the only thing that we need to do is to make sure that we are not undermining the efforts of the sectors that are trying to make a difference. And that is going to happen if every sector steps up to do what must be done and what they can do at the moment.
Oh, Elizabeth, fantastic. You're absolutely right. We're very good about making these commitments, but if every single one of us actually took concrete action in the way that you're describing, that's the sort of thing that would make a difference in communities. So thank you. Thank you very much. Now I have one last question that I'm going to put to all of you. And it's a question, and I'm going to globalize it from the question a little bit. Tobias Battle from the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation, which is a partner in one of the commissions that we're doing. SITE is the acronym. Tobias asks us to think about the students at SITE, and he would like you to give a message to those students. So let's now think about all the students in the world, all the young people in the world, and as they contemplate the future, what's your message to young people based on your experience about how they can have the maximum impact to address the issue of the climate emergency and building forward greener? So I'm going to go in reverse order from where we started, and I'm going to start with Jun Ma. A message to the young people of the world, Jun.
Wow, that's a big one. And yeah, we definitely absolutely need the young people to not just be aware of these challenges, but also be part of the solutions. I mean, today we can see very clear model example from Elizabeth and how important it is for the young people to join the efforts and never think that your voice will not be heard. In China, I mentioned about all this vast improvement of air quality and to much extent water quality. But think about, it is the result of millions of young people made their voice heard when Beijing and the surrounding regions suffered, weeks upon weeks of very bad smoggy days. That triggered eventually a massive change. And today on the climate side, on the biodiversity side, on the ocean protection side, there's so much that you can do. And I know you have the skills that my generation probably don't have. And so I really, really hope that you can join. And we're building the digital platform, and we're open to hope that we can work together on that.
Fantastic, Jun, thank you. Ifeanyi, a message to the world.
Message to the children of the world: the time for action is now, not in 10 years' time, not when you become an adult, not when you will become a politician. The time for action is now. And you have the tools to create that action. Thank you.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Gillian.
Somebody you've never heard of named Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So my guidance to you is to know that you can make a difference and try.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for those words, Gillian. Thank you. Elizabeth, you are that generation. I'm asking you to speak to your fellows in your generation. So please, what message would you pass to your friends and colleagues?
Every day, I'm inspired by all of my fellow young people who are refusing to be victims and working tirelessly to deliver solutions and to advocate for the kind of world that we want, and that's a livable world and a safe future. And we can all see that this is a whole generation of humans who are pouring energy and creativity into regenerating a dying world. And so I do encourage all of the students and all of the young people to keep going, because we will make that change happen, and we will get governments, organizations, and everyone else to get behind our generation, and to also take our interests seriously, and even make sure that they're supporting the great work that we are doing, because that's the only way that we are going to create that kind of world that we all envision, so we can all make that difference. And I would just add a quote from the late Professor Wangari Maathai, which happens to be my favorite, that those of us who understand and who feel strongly must not tire, and we must not give up, because the burden is on us who know. Those who don't are at peace, and it is us who know that get disturbed and are caused to take action. So we have to keep going.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a beautiful, beautiful words. And Andy, close us out.
Well, I mean, as we've heard, young people have enormous influence and power at the moment. But I would say for those young people in education, make sure that you insist that your institution provides you with education about climate change, about environmental health, planetary health, and what you can do about it. I know, because I was a former dean of an institution, that you have to listen to the students, and they need to demand that we change our curricula to reflect the challenges of today and not the challenges of the past. So that's really crucial, and that can be done at the school level and the university level. Hold your institutions accountable as well for their investments. Some institutions have investments, and it's really important that they actually invest those in low carbon solutions in the future, and again, not in the past. And work across disciplinary boundaries. So don't be constrained by conventional career structures, because you need to actually break out of those narrow silos. You know, many of us were trained in very narrow ways, but now the opportunity is to work with other disciplines in a respectful way, understanding the ways in which social science, physical sciences, health sciences can all work together to understand the kind of solutions and the ways forward. So it's a very exciting, it's a daunting time, it's a very exciting time. Young people must shape the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. A big thanks to our panel. Thanks, everybody.